And one writer pointed out that there are basically three stages of anti-Semitism. Stage 1, conversion. Stage 2, expulsion. Stage 3, annihilation. Now let me explain those. Stage 1, conversion. By conversion, I mean we all need to be converted, Jew or Gentile. We need to be converted to God. But they're talking about conversion to leave everything Jewish behind and become a Gentile Christian. So the first stage of anti-Semitism is to tell the Jews, you have no right to live among us as Jews. The next step is expulsion. You have no right to live among us. Go somewhere else. Third stage, you have no right to live, period. Hitler's final solution. Those are the three stages: conversion, expulsion, annihilation. No right to live among us as Jews. No right to live among us. No right to live, period. Final solution. Why do you think the Holocaust was called the final solution? See, we have to understand about the Holocaust some things. We need to understand that the Holocaust was not something that just kind of suddenly occurred in a single generation. The Holocaust was something that came about from it was a cumulative thing. It was century after century after century of this being built upon all of this Christian anti-Semitism, century after century, and that was just the culmination of it. Now, let me talk a little bit about Christian anti-Semitism. We can go back to the 2nd century, the early church fathers, so-called. Now, you could say, well, they weren't exactly anti-Semitic, but they did make some negative statements about Jews and Judaism. If you read the Epistle of Barnabas, for example, and that's not the Barnabas of the Bible, it's a later Barnabas of the 2nd century. In the Epistle of Barnabas, it's talking about the fact that those silly Jews believe that the dietary laws are meant to be kept in a literal way. Those Jews don't understand that God didn't really expect people to abstain from pork. He just meant don't behave like pigs. So he said don't eat pork, because he meant to not behave like pigs. I'm paraphrasing. But that's basically the message in the Epistle of Barnabas, is just those Jews, they don't understand. It's just all to be spiritualized. And you can read Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho the Jew. You get the same thing. You know, this was a conversation that the Christian Justin Martyr was having with Trypho the Jew. And Trypho the Jew is, you know, he's trying to persuade Trypho that Jesus was the Messiah. And Trypho the Jew says to him, well, if he was the Messiah, then why do you Christians, why do you not keep the Sabbath? Why do you eat pork? Why do you not keep the festivals on God's calendar? If you can explain to us why you don't do these things, then maybe we'll consider this Jesus as a possibility of being the Messiah. And Justin Martyr's reply to him was, you understand everything in a carnal way. That's all he had to say to him. Now, these kind of negative statements by the 2nd century church fathers, and there are others you could read as well, these kind of negative statements about Jews and Judaism, I mean, they're not really insinuating any kind of malice toward Jews, maybe. They're certainly not suggesting that we harm the Jews, but it's more of a condescending, you poor Jews, you know. At worst, it's ridicule. But let's go from the 2nd century, let's go forward a little bit to the time of Emperor Constantine. You know, you all know the story of Constantine, I hope. You know, he was a heathen emperor of Rome, and he supposedly had the vision of the cross, conquer in this name, and you know, he got victory, so he decided Christianity, we're going to quit persecuting the Christians, we're going to have Christianity be the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Now, I think that was 312 or 316, I forget, but then in the year 325 they had the Council of Nicaea. Church leaders come together. One thing they wrote, one decision they made at the Council of Nicaea was this. They said, let us have nothing in common with the detestable Jewish crowd. Detestable, you know, detest means hate. Let us have nothing in common with the detestable Jewish crowd. They were talking about calendar issues. You know, Passover date for the Sabbath, Saturday or Sunday. That was one of the reasons they decided we don't want Christians keeping Sabbath on 7th day. We want Sunday to be the day. That's 325 AD. Let's fast forward a little bit to the time of John Chrysostom, who lived from 349 to 407. John Chrysostom means the golden mouth because he was such an eloquent preacher, the greatest preacher of his day. Now, he said many beautiful, wonderful things about the Lord, but you know what he said about the Jews? Here it is from his sermon. This is what he says about Jews. Such animals, when they are unfit for work, become fit for the slaughter. It was this fate, then, that the Jews suffered. In making themselves useless for work, they became fit for the slaughter. Do you have to join in greeting them and exchange a scant word? Shouldn't you turn away from them because they are the common corruption and disease of the whole world? Do you see that the demons dwell in their souls? The Jews themselves are demons. Consequently, we must hate both them and the synagogue all the more. This was from great Christian leader John Chrysostom. Now, between John Chrysostom and the Holocaust, there are way too many quotes I could give you, way too much anti-Semitism, but let me just give you a few examples. The year 613, persecution of Jews in Spain. All Jews who refused to be baptized had to leave the country. A few years later, the remaining Jews were dispossessed, declared as slaves, and given to pious Christians of position. All Jewish children 7 years and over were taken from their parents, given to receive a Christian education. The year 1096, the First Crusade, as the Crusaders were making their way to the Holy Land in Germany along the cities on the Rhine River alone, 12,000 Jews were killed by the Crusaders. Why? Because they were Jews. Year 1121, the Jews were driven out of Flanders. The years 1146 and 47, the beginning of the Second Crusade. The French monk Rudolph called for the destruction of the Jews as an introduction to the Second Crusade. Now, fortunately for the Jews, there was another Christian monk named Bernard of Clairvaux who, tried to tone it down. He was somewhat of a friend of the Jews, but even this friend of the Jews, Bernard of Clairvaux, said about the Jews, he called them an evil seed with a stupidity bestial and more than bestial, and intelligent, coarse, dense, and as it were bovine. I mean, this guy was one of the guys who was friendly to the Jews. And a contemporary of Bernard was Peter the Venerable, another man who's considered the most beautiful, wonderful, peace-loving Christian of his generation, said, "Truly I doubt whether a Jew can be really human. I lead out from its den a monstrous animal and show it as a laughingstock in the amphitheater of the world, in the sight of all the people. I bring thee forward, thou Jew, thou brute beast, in the sight of all men." These were the wonderful church leaders. Then, of course, the Crusaders, they got to Jerusalem, and they were fighting the Muslims primarily. But while they were there in Jerusalem, the Jews all fled to the synagogue. So what did the Crusaders do? With all the Jews in the synagogue, they set the synagogue on fire and surrounded the synagogue singing the hymn, "Christ we adore thee," with the crosses on their breast and holding crosses aloft. Now, I'm not making this stuff up. You can read this stuff in history books. You can go to any library probably and find, or Barnes & Noble, find some books on this stuff. I mean, I've got here, this is from way back in 1983, a calendar of Jewish persecutions. It just kind of gives some of the highlights of Jewish persecution by Christians. And you can go through, you can read about, I mean, some of it's too gory to even talk about it. I've got this book here. I don't know if any of you have seen this book by Michael L. Brown, a Jewish believer, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood. It's about the history of Christian anti-Semitism. I mean, it talks about Christians, taking Jews, not just expelling them, burning them at the stake, mutilating them, beheading them, butchering them, rapes, not just of entire communities, entire villages of Jews being burned alive. Forced conversions. 1478, Spanish Inquisition. To torture, the Spaniards said, if you Jews want to stay here, you got to convert, become Christian, become Roman Catholic. And some of them did, but then they would secretly do their Jewish stuff because they were just doing an external conversion. And so if they suspected the Jew of still secretly keeping Passover, still secretly abstaining from pork, still secretly eating unleavened bread during Passover, they would torture them to get them to confess. And then if a Jew who had converted, if he got caught doing some of that Jewish stuff, which was really biblical stuff, if he said, okay, I'll stop doing it, I'll come back to the church, they would have to go through this. This is out of Michael Brown's book. If they wanted to come back into the church, they had to be paraded through the streets, men and women alike, bareheaded, barefooted, and naked to the waist. The procession headed by a group of monks. They held unlit candles in their hands, the Jews did, indicating they were yet in spiritual darkness. They were marched through the city till they arrived at the cathedral. A chaplain would make the sign of the cross on the foreheads of these Jews, many of whom had been prominent citizens and respected leaders of their city. Then he would recite these words, "Receive the sign of the cross which you denied, and which being deluded you lost." And then there would be a sermon, and then they were to be whipped in procession on each of the following 6 Fridays, naked to the waist, bareheaded, barefooted, and they were to fast on each of those 6 Fridays, and they were disqualified for the rest of their lives from holding office, benefice, or honorable employment. Typical treatment of the Jews in Spain. So the culmination of all this, century after century of these sorts of things, the culmination of the church's anti-Semitism was the Holocaust. The Nazis and their concentration camps and the 6 million Jews. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, but Daniel, the Nazis weren't real Christians. Well, I know that, and you know that. But what is a Jew supposed to think? I mean, think about this. What is a Jew supposed to think? Prior to the Holocaust, you had century after century after century of bloody, butchering persecution done in the name of Jesus. And the Nazis were church-going people. Most of them, they were professing Christians, Lutherans or Catholics or whatever. They were a church-going culture. And the motto of the German Christians, and this is out of Erdman's Handbook to the History of Christianity, the motto of the German Christians was, quote, "The swastika on our breasts, the cross in our hearts." Also from the same Christian book, it says, a German pastor named Luthuser said these words. He said, "Christ has come to us through Adolf Hitler. We know today the Savior has come." So what's a Jew supposed to think? I mean, we can say, well, those guys weren't real Christians. But what is a Jew supposed to think? At the Nuremberg war crimes trials, when the Nazis were put on trial for the war crimes, you know what they did to defend themselves? They quoted from Martin Luther, the great reformer, the father of the Protestant Reformation. They said, hey, we're just doing what Luther said to do. Martin Luther said this, and this is not some internet rumor. This is straight out of Martin Luther's writings. You can go to the library and get them. Martin Luther said of the Jews, he said, this is how you deal with the Jews. He said, first, their synagogues should be set on fire. Secondly, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifthly, passport and traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. Sixthly, they ought to be stopped from usury. Seventhly, let the young and strong Jews and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe, the hoe, the spade, the distaff, the spindle, and let them earn their bread by the sweat of their noses. We ought to drive the rascally lazy bones out of their system. Therefore, away with them. If this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one, so that you and we may all be free of this insufferable devilish burden, the Jews. The words of Martin Luther. Here's another quote from Luther's same article. He called Jews these dreary dregs, this stinking scum, this dried up froth, this moldy leaven and boggy morass of Jewry. Jews are nothing but rotten, stinking, rejected dregs of their father's lineage. Therefore, whenever you see a genuine Jew, you may with a good conscience cross yourself and bluntly say, there goes a devil incarnate. Words of Martin Luther. One more, he says, you Jews are not worthy of looking at the outside of the Bible, much less of reading it. You should read only the Bible that is found under the sow's tail and eat and drink the letters that drop from there. So you can say to me, well, Dan, the Nazis weren't real Christians. Was Martin Luther a real Christian? The Christian world, Protestants at least, hail him as a holy hero. And the Jews know that Christians hail Martin Luther as a holy hero. So what's a Jew supposed to think? Whether or not Martin Luther was a true Christian, it's not for me to decide. But Jews know what he said. Most Christians don't have a clue about this stuff. But Jews know what Martin Luther said. And Jews know that Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, 1938, when the Nazis first went on a rampage, broke all the Jewish homes and the shops, broke all the glass, all the windows, and really got the Holocaust launched. They chose to do it on November 9th in honor of Martin Luther's birthday. So what is a Jew supposed to think? We can say the Nazis weren't Christians. Okay, we understand that. But to put yourself in the shoes of Jewish people, suppose this. Suppose that